I'm going to give you a little bit of a different presentation from what we've heard thus far, because I'm going to go to where the arguments started and where they've ended up and what has happened. Where this started actually is not about marriage. We were receiving information early on in the marriage fight all over the world about the marriage fight. It wasn't considered anything in the 90s. In fact, if you look in the late 90s, you'll find the homosexual activists themselves arguing about the want for marriage. The typical argument was, why would we want an institution that is about monogamous relationships forever? That's insane. And if you know anything about the gay community, you'll know that their rate of monogamy approaches zero. And so they wondered, the activists themselves, I'm not talking just your average person with same-sex attraction in the street, I'm talking the activists themselves arguing amongst themselves, why would we go for marriage? But it was very interesting, the answer. The answer was because we need societal approval for our same-sex relationships. And it was the sexuality in the relationships that made them somewhat special, somewhat unique. Why? Because there's all sorts of same-sex relationships. We're encouraged. They're encouraged by the faith. They're encouraged by every form of civilized culture. Same-sex relationships are great, but not sexual relationships. Not sexual same-sex relationships. And what is the need for this? Why is this so? Well, if you're from a Christian persuasion, but even from a persuasion of natural law, you know that when you're doing things that you shouldn't be doing, it's hurting you. You get guilt, but you also get harm to your bodies, because if you're Christian, you believe God made your bodies. And if you're not even, you know that from the empirical evidence that you get, there are certain activities that are harmful. And so this is the way the debate went in the beginning. The argument, though, won over that we need this for a societal stamp of approval. And they got there. Obviously, in many countries around the world, this happened. In fact, in Canada, this same-sex marriage passed in 2005. My colleague Steve Jelsovac and I were asked at the time to sit on an advisory board to the Ontario Bishops' Conference, that's the Catholic Bishops of Ontario, into how to deal with this. We were dealing with it in 2004, and it was going to be a year or so out before we would have the eventual passage of the law. Very interestingly, what was said at the meeting was this. We presented, look, we've been following this issue now for some 10 years or more, and we can tell you that this really isn't that much about marriage as it is about homosexuality, homosexual sex. And so really what needs to happen, now we're talking to bishops, is the church, the Catholic Church, the Christian leadership has to stop its silence, because literally we've had silence on this issue for about 50 years. And what has happened is a massive disconnect between the pew sitters and those who actually know what the faith teaches, because the faith actually teaches nothing about hatred toward gays and lesbians. In fact, the opposite. But it also says that the behavior is damaging and harmful to your eternal salvation. That's the faith teaching. But they also know from the empirical evidence that the behavior is damaging to your body as well. If you look at it from that perspective, though, that's a perspective of love, not hatred at all. When you are parents and you deal with your children who are misbehaving, you correct them. Why? Not because you hate them, because you love them. What if they complain? You still correct them because you love them. Because that complaint you will bear, you will take it because you know you're doing the best for them. And so with the same-sex marriage argument, we have the exact same thing. And yet, it's the argument that we never present. Not even from our religious leadership. In the beginning, the question is always between, how come if these two guys love each other, they can't get married? And if we can't answer that question with love, we're going to be in trouble, because love trumps almost every argument. So the answer back is quite simple. Hey, we love you enough to tell you that this is harmful. In fact, we'll even take the hater and bigot label so that we can tell you this because we care about you. And the reason why in the court they talk about this, they talk about it in terms of what they call animus. Animus comes from animosity, where we get a hatred towards somebody or a feeling of ill will toward them. And this was the famous distinction that has always been fought from the beginning. In Christian culture, we always had this saying, You love the sinner and you hate the sin. That distinction has been fought from the time this sort of war, if you will, began, because they want intentional confusion in that aspect. And it's in the courts as well. The courts are suggesting that there is an animus on the part of those who are opposed to same-sex marriage towards people who are same-sex attracted. And nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, I'm sure that exists in a few people, but the motivation from all of the faith groups, which are the majority that are fighting for traditional marriage, their position is one of animus against what? Animus against a behavior that is so incredibly harmful for the individual. And so the reason why this will play out in the future is because you can see what happens in the end. As I said, Canada passed same-sex marriage in 2005. And you always think, like Kathy was saying originally with the abortion decision, Roe decision, now we'll have cultural peace. There's no cultural peace at all. In fact, you find an increase in exactly what you're already experiencing that we saw with the RIFLA laws in Indiana, this great animosity toward normal Christian belief. But what comes down the road even after that is the same pursuit, this pursuit of needing to eliminate any kind of thinking badly about same-sex behavior. And it comes to us, to our children. The imposition of sex education that teaches homosexuality as right, normal, good, and wonderful in Canada should be a lesson for all Americans. The same thing is going on in Europe. Parents forbidden from excusing their children from these classes, and the courts determining that this shall be in schools, and not just public schools. It shall be in Catholic schools, in Christian schools, and in the province of Quebec, even in homeschooling. So this is where we're headed. And the reason why we need to focus on the love argument is because once you're beyond marriage and you're into that new imposition, if they think of you as just bigots, like racists, because you're against a class of people because you don't believe in their dignity, they will have no reason not to, as Cardinal George would say, make us die in our prisons. And I think we need to revisit this teaching, mostly from our pulpits, of our own love and concern for our brothers and sisters who are same-sex attracted. Because we have to show our reason for being here, our reason for doing this is an altruistic reason. Because without that, they will say, look at the bigots, and we need to be, we need to just quell this dissent. And let me just conclude with the words. Many, all over the world, when I speak on these issues, there are very many people who take the science and say it's wrong, it's biased. Oh, they're all anti-gay scientists who said that there's all these harms with same-sex behavior. And aren't there just as many harms with, heterosexual behavior and so on and so forth? And we argue a little bit about studies, but eventually you just can't do that anymore. And there was a very interesting thing, and I'll conclude with this, that happened in Canada in 2006, the year after same-sex marriage was passed. One of the Canadian gay activist leaders, who, by the way, died a couple years ago at 66 years old, which is very typical, early death, that is. He made a presentation before government asking for extra health care dollars for LGBT Canadians. And I'm going to read you his words. They are some of the most powerful words convicting me and anyone who cares enough about our brothers and sisters who are in these damaging relationships to strive to encourage them not to go there. And if you're Christian, the reasons are even more. They're eternal. And here are the words of Jens Hellquist, who was the director of the Canadian Rainbow Health Coalition. We have, he said, one of the poorest health statuses in this country. Health issues affecting queer Canadians include lower life expectancy than the average Canadian, suicide, higher rates of substance abuse, depression, inadequate access to care, and HIV/AIDS. He said there are all kinds of health issues that are endemic to our community. We have higher rates of anal cancer in the gay male community. Lesbians have higher rates of breast cancer. And then he concluded with these words. Now that we can get married, everyone assumes that we don't have any issues anymore. A lot of the deaths that occur in our community are hidden. We don't see them. and those of us who are working on the front lines see them, and I'm tired of watching my community die. Thank you for your time.